Chapter 1. A Genoese Dream and Portugal's Refusal, midnight 3:30. At the close of the 15th century, European maps ended abruptly at the edge of the Atlantic Ocean. Beyond the coasts of Portugal and Spain lay nothing but a vast blue expanse, known in medieval lore as the Sea of Darkness, a place superstition claimed was populated by monsters capable of swallowing entire ships. Yet, behind these myths, one man looked out at the ocean not with fear, but with blind ambition. His name was Christopher Columbus, a self-taught navigator born in the Republic of Genoa. Columbus held a theory that, in the eyes of his contemporaries, seemed like utter madness. He believed the Earth was much smaller than the scholars of the time estimated, and that Asia, with all its legendary riches described by Marco Polo, lay just a few weeks' sail directly to the west across the Atlantic. In the year 1485, brimming with confidence, Columbus secured an audience at the court of King João II of Portugal. Portugal was the undisputed naval superpower of the era, and Columbus asked the king for 3 fast ships and the title of Admiral of the Ocean Sea, in exchange for opening a direct route to the Indies. The king forwarded Columbus's plans to his royal committee of experts. Their verdict was merciless. Columbus had completely miscalculated the size of the planet. The Portuguese mathematicians were correct. The Earth was far larger and Asia far more distant than the Genoese sailor believed. King João II politely refused him, viewing the project as a useless waste of money and human lives. The next 7 years were an ordeal of humiliation and poverty for Columbus. He moved to Spain, where he attempted to win the backing of the Catholic monarchs, Queen Isabella of Castile and King Ferdinand of Aragon. For years, a Spanish commission analyzed and repeatedly rejected his proposals. Columbus ended up living off the charity of churches and the sale of maps, often mocked in the streets of Córdoba and Madrid. However, the year 1492 would change everything. In January, Spanish armies conquered Granada, the last Muslim stronghold on the Iberian Peninsula, bringing an end to a centuries-long struggle known as the Reconquista. With Spain unified under the banner of Catholicism, the king and queen were looking for a grand new project to expand their global influence and replenish a treasury drained by war. Furthermore, Spain watched with frustration as Portugal dominated the sea routes around Africa. Queen Isabella, finally won over by Columbus's fanaticism and absolute certainty, made a historic decision. She agreed to finance the expedition. On the morning of August 3rd, 1492, from the port of Palos de la Frontera, 3 small ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the flagship Santa Maria, set sail. On board were 90 men, many of them released from prisons in exchange for participating in this perilous journey. No one knew if they would ever return. Chapter 2. The Ottoman Blockade and the Spice Race, 336-30. To truly understand why Spain and Portugal were willing to risk fortunes at sea, one must examine an economic crisis that had been plaguing Europe for several decades. For centuries, Europeans had depended entirely on the Silk Road, a massive network of land routes connecting Europe to China and India. Through this channel flowed goods that defined the social status of the European nobility. Fine silk, porcelain, teas, ivory, precious metals, and above all, spices. In the 15th century, spices like pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, and clove were not mere ingredients for flavor. In a Europe devoid of refrigeration technology, meat spoiled rapidly, and spices were the only way to mask the taste of rot and preserve food for the winter. Some spices were so rare and valuable that a single sack of pepper was worth more than a peasant's life, often used as currency to pay rent or taxes. Everything collapsed in May 1453. Ottoman armies led by Sultan Mehmed II conquered Constantinople, bringing an end to the Byzantine Empire. This catastrophic geopolitical event for the Christian world meant that the Ottoman Empire took absolute control over the western end of the Silk Road and the routes of the Eastern Mediterranean. The Ottomans did not ban trade, but they imposed such exorbitant customs duties that the prices of Asian goods skyrocketed in Europe. Merchants from Venice and Genoa, who held a monopoly in the Mediterranean, were brought to their knees. Europe was forced by circumstances to find another way to reach India, a route that would completely bypass Muslim territories. Thus began the Age of Discovery. The Portuguese were the first to act strategically. Under the impulse of Prince Henry the Navigator, they began systematically mapping the west coast of Africa. Their plan was clear, though incredibly long. Sail down the length of the African continent, find its southern tip, and enter the Indian Ocean to navigate directly to the source of the spices. This relentless strategy worked, transforming Portugal into the technological leader of the seas. In this context of fierce rivalry, Columbus's proposal to head west seemed like the perfect shortcut for Spain. If the Portuguese needed decades to encircle Africa, Spain hoped to reach China in just a few weeks, striking directly at the heart of the Portuguese monopoly. Chapter 3. Land Ho. The Chronicle of a Historic Misunderstanding, 639–30. Let's return to the Atlantic in the autumn of 1492. More than 5 weeks had passed since Columbus's ships had lost sight of the last known islands, the Canaries. The crew was terrified. In that era, sailors usually navigated by keeping the coastline in view. Being in the middle of the ocean with no reference points was a psychological nightmare. Terrified that they would run out of water and food, or that the easterly winds would prevent them from ever returning to Europe, the sailors began to whisper of mutiny. To maintain order, Columbus resorted to a trick. He kept 2 logbooks, a real one, in which he noted the enormous distances traveled, and a false one that he showed the crew, indicating much shorter distances so as to not panic them. The tension reached a boiling point in early October. The crew gave Columbus an ultimatum. If they did not see land within 3 days, the ships would turn back to Spain, even if it meant arresting the admiral. Columbus accepted, betting everything on his last card. Salvation came in the dead of night on October 12, 1492, at 2 o'clock in the morning. A sailor aboard the Pinta, Redrew de Triana, spotted a white streak of sand in the moonlight. "Land! Land!" he shouted. The dawn revealed a lush, tropical island in the Bahamas archipelago, which Columbus named San Salvador. When the Spaniards stepped onto the beach, armed and carrying royal banners, they were met by peaceful locals from the Taino tribe. These people were completely naked, their bodies painted, and they were intensely curious. Columbus, blinded by his own theory, was absolutely convinced he had landed on an island on the periphery of India or Japan. Because of this, he called the locals Indians, a monumental geographical blunder that would remain etched into global vocabulary forever. The natives received the Europeans with hospitality, offering them parrots, balls of cotton thread, and wooden spears. Columbus immediately noticed a detail that ignited his predatory instinct. Some locals wore small gold ornaments in their noses. In his journal that day, Columbus wrote words that would seal the fate of the New World. "They do not bear arms, nor do they know them. With 50 men we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we desire. They would make good servants and could easily be made Christians." Chapter 4. The Second Expedition and the Founding of the New World, 930–1230. The success of the first voyage triggered a literal gold rush at the Spanish court. No one hesitated. In September 1493, Columbus departed on his second expedition, but this time it was no longer a discreet mission of exploration. It was a veritable army of occupation. The fleet was composed of 17 massive ships carrying over 1,200 men. Professional soldiers, bankrupt aristocrats looking for quick wealth, priests eager to convert souls, and artisans. The ships were also loaded with animals unknown to the Americas: horses, pigs, sheep, and cattle, destined to radically alter the local ecosystem. Alongside these, the Spaniards brought packs of Alano and Mastiff war dogs, massive animals trained specifically for combat, used to hunt down and maul natives who dared to resist. When Columbus returned to Fort Navidad on Hispaniola, he found a scene of horror. All 39 sailors left behind had been massacred by the natives. The reason? The Europeans had abused the hospitality of the locals, plundering their villages for gold and assaulting their women. This incident permanently shattered the myth of the peaceful paradise and unleashed a wave of brutal retaliation from the Spaniards. Rising above these ruins, in 1496, on the southern coast of Hispaniola, the Spaniards laid the foundations of Santo Domingo. This became the first official and permanent European settlement in the Americas. The city was built on the model of those in Castile, with a central square, a stone church, and a customs house. From here, Spanish governors would coordinate the brutal exploitation of the entire Caribbean basin. The system imposed by Columbus was one of forced labor. Every native over the age of 14 was forced to deliver a certain quota of gold dust every 3 months. Those who failed to meet their quotas suffered atrocious punishments. The Spaniards cut off their hands and left them to bleed to death. The despair was so profound that thousands of natives committed mass suicide or killed their own children to save them from Spanish slavery. Chapter 5. The Treaty of Tordesillas. How the planet was divided, 1230–1530. While the Spanish colonists were building Santo Domingo, an all-out war was brewing in Europe. King João II of Portugal was furious. He claimed that, based on earlier papal agreements, all lands discovered by Columbus in the Atlantic belonged by right to Portugal. Portuguese war fleets were ready to sail from port to seize the territories claimed by Spain. Aware that a direct conflict with the Portuguese navy could ruin their plans, the Spanish monarchs appealed to the highest moral authority of the time, Pope Alexander VI. The Pope, who was of Spanish origin, from the infamous Borgia family, issued a series of documents that clearly favored Spain's interests. However, the Portuguese were not intimidated and demanded direct negotiations. Diplomats from the two superpowers met in the small Castilian town of Tordesillas in the spring of 1494. There, on a wooden table, the fate of the world was decided without a single representative of the millions of people living in the Americas, Africa, or Asia being present. The result was the Treaty of Tordesillas. It was agreed to draw an imaginary meridian line of demarcation from north to south, located 370 leagues, about 2,000 kilometers, west of the Cape Verde Islands. The logic of the treaty was strikingly simple. Everything discovered to the west of this line belonged to the Crown of Spain, and everything to the east went to Portugal. Spain thus received a monopoly over the Americas, while Portugal secured absolute control over the route around Africa and into the Indian Ocean. However, Portuguese diplomats insisted that the line be moved a bit further west than the Pope had originally proposed. This insistence proved to be a political masterstroke. At that moment, in 1494, no one knew the exact shape of the South American continent. But 6 years later, in the year 1500, a Portuguese fleet led by Pedro Álvares Cabral set sail for India. To avoid the weak currents along the coast of Africa, Cabral navigated far to the west, into the open Atlantic. On April 22, 1500, Cabral sailors spotted the silhouette of a mountain on the horizon. Landing on the northeastern coast of South America, in the region of Bahia, Cabral quickly realized that this massive piece of land lay east of the line established by the Treaty of Tordesillas. Thus, he claimed the territory in the name of the King of Portugal. That strip of land jutting into the Portuguese zone was initially called the Land of the Holy Cross, but it later received the name Brazil after the valuable it found there. Thanks to that negotiation in Tordesillas, Brazil became Portugal's only colony in South America, defining the linguistic and cultural map of the continent to this day. Chapter 6. The Fall of Giants. Cortés and Pizarro, 1530–1930. By 1519, the Spaniards had transformed the Caribbean into a secure logistical base. They had colonized Puerto Rico, Jamaica, and Cuba, but the gold in the islands was rapidly running out. Rumors of fabulously wealthy empires hidden deep within the mainland ignited the imagination of a new type of European adventurer, the conquistador. These were not disciplined soldiers of a regular army, but mercenaries, down on their luck nobles, and ambitious men ready for anything in exchange for glory and enrichment. The most famous among them was Hernán Cortés. In February 1519, defying direct orders from the governor of Cuba, Cortés landed on the coast of Mexico with just 11 ships, 500 soldiers, 13 horses, and a few light pieces of artillery. To show his men that there was no turning back, Cortés took a radical step. He ordered all the expedition's ships to be burned on the beach. The options were simple: conquest or death. Cortés's target was the Aztec Empire, a military superpower that dominated Mesoamerica. Their capital, Tenochtitlan, was a marvel of engineering, a huge city built in the middle of a lake, crisscrossed by canals and causeways, with a population of over 200,000 inhabitants, much larger and cleaner than London or Paris at the time. The Aztecs were ruled by Emperor Moctezuma II. How did a handful of 500 Spaniards manage to destroy an empire of millions of subjects? The answer lies in three crucial factors: technology, Machiavellian diplomacy, and biological weapons. First, the Spaniards possessed steel sword from Toledo, metal armor, and firearms, matchlocks and cannons, that caused immense psychological shock through smoke and thunder. Furthermore, horses, animals completely unknown in the Americas, made the Spaniards look like semi-divine, mythological creatures in the initial confrontations. Second, Cortés was a brilliant strategist. He realized that the Aztecs were bitterly hated by neighboring tribes, whom they had subjugated and subjected to heavy taxes and thousands of prisoners for human sacrifice. Cortés formed alliances with these tribes, particularly the Tlaxcalans, obtaining a supporting army of tens of thousands of indigenous warriors. A key role was played by a native woman, Malinche, who became his translator, mistress, and strategic advisor. But the third factor was the deadliest: smallpox. One of Cortés's soldiers was infected with this viral disease. Native Americans, isolated from the rest of the world for millennia, had absolutely no genetic immunity to European diseases. The epidemic spread like wildfire through Tenochtitlan, killing nearly half the city's population, including Moctezuma's successor. People died in their beds, unable to move, while the military and political structure of the empire collapsed from within. In August 1521, after a brutal months-long siege that reduced the city to ruins, Tenochtitlan fell. The Aztec Empire had ceased to exist. 10 years later, another conquistador, illiterate but ruthlessly iron-willed, named Francisco Pizarro, applied the exact same recipe in South America. In 1532, Pizarro landed on the coast of Peru with only 168 men. His target was the Inca Empire, a gigantic state stretching along the Andes Mountains. Pizarro arrived at a moment of extreme weakness for the empire, which had just been devastated by an early epidemic of smallpox and a bloody civil war for succession between two brothers, Atahualpa and Huáscar. Atahualpa had emerged victorious and was in the mountain city of Cajamarca, surrounded by an army of 80,000 warriors. Pizarro set an incredible trap for Atahualpa. He invited the emperor to a peaceful meeting in the central square of Cajamarca. Atahualpa arrived carried on a golden litter, accompanied by thousands of unarmed courtiers as a sign of respect. When the emperor rejected the Bible offered by a Spanish priest, Pizarro's troops, hidden in the surrounding buildings, opened fire with cannons and muskets. The massacre was absolute. Thousands of Incas were killed in minutes without being able to strike back, and Atahualpa was captured. Chapter 7. The Intrigues of the Superpowers: France, England, and Failures in the North, 1930-2100 hours. While Spanish galleons crossed the Atlantic laden with Aztec gold and Incan silver, France and England watched from the sidelines with deep jealousy. The two northern powers decided to completely ignore the Treaty of Tordesillas. The King of France, Francis I, perfectly summarized this frustration in a famous declaration. I would like to see the clause in Adam's will that excludes me from the division of the world. France was the first to finance a serious expedition to the north. In 1534, navigator Jacques Cartier was sent to find a northwest passage to Asia. Cartier explored the coast of Newfoundland and sailed up the St. Lawrence River, penetrating deep into the territory of modern-day Canada. On the Gaspé Peninsula, he planted a massive 10-meter wooden cross bearing the coat of arms of the King of France, claiming the land under the name of New France. However, unlike the Spaniards, the French faced a harsh reality. There were no cities of gold, only endless forests, hostile indigenous tribes, and Canadian winters of apocalyptic severity. During the winter of 1535, Cartier's crew was decimated by scurvy. Men bled and lost their teeth until the local Huron tribe showed them a life-saving remedy, a tea made from the bark and needles of the arborvitae tree, rich in vitamin C. France's subsequent attempts to found colonies in Quebec, 1541, South Carolina, 1562, or Florida, 1564, all failed dramatically, either due to the climate or the merciless attacks of the Spaniards, who patrolled the coast to protect their monopoly. By the end of the 16th century, France had no permanent settlement in the New World. England, on the other hand, entered the race later, but with a much more aggressive strategy under the leadership of Queen Elizabeth I, who ascended the throne in 1558. Elizabeth understood that she did not have the resources to conquer land empires, so she resorted to asymmetric warfare. She officially sponsored privateers, legalized pirates such as Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh. Their mission was simple: stock Spanish galleons in the Caribbean, capture them, and bring the gold back to London. This strategy filled England's coffers and crippled Spanish morale. In 1584, Walter Raleigh received a royal charter to establish the first English colony in North America, a region he named Virginia, in honor of Queen Elizabeth, known as the Virgin Queen. In 1585, the English landed on Roanoke Island, off the coast of modern-day North Carolina. The Roanoke colony was a failure of historic proportions and gave birth to one of history's greatest mysteries. The colonists did not know how to farm the land and quickly